this session. Awesome. Welcome. I knew some more were coming in, but let me introduce today's speaker. Thank you for coming. Dr. Danica M. Moore is an experienced scholar, practitioner, nonprofit founder, CEO, and shoe and sports fanatic. She's also a lifelong learner with a demonstrated history working in educational institutions and education management systems. She possesses highly recognized skills in program evaluation, curriculum and program development, research and educational leadership, all intersecting with racial equity work. Her early career as an educator began in religious organizations at the age of 11, redesigning youth education content from lessons for kindergarten through fifth grade students. Later, she became involved with kindergarten through fifth grade summer school opportunities for public school districts in rural areas. This experience created a foundation for her BSc in elementary education from the University of Kansas, followed by an MSc focused on curriculum and instruction with an emphasis in PE-SOL. It was during her graduate program she launched her research centering student identity as an impact on teaching expectations using urban and suburban public school districts. She completed her doctorates in learning and educational change from Vanderbilt University's Peabody College. Dr. Moore has served as an elementary classroom teacher, a special education interventionist, a title reading and math specialist, and an English language learner interventionist for kindergarten through sixth grade, before moving into district leadership roles as an equity facilitator, consultant, and founding for fortified educational practices. Dr. Moore also serves as a youth and family education coordinator for Unity, where she designs, teaches, and shapes young minds from birth to fifth grade through anti-racist spirituality. While her passion and her foundation are with educational institutions, Dr. Moore has developed workshops and performs analysis of leadership, academics, and human resource offices, focus on retention and recruitment of diverse social identities, as well as social service organizations, businesses, and city government offices. Her knowledge and skill base provide resource for institutions navigating professional support communities across multiple identity layers, including race, gender expression, and sexuality. Her contributions have been a model for many Midwestern school districts. Implementations at the center of her methods are intentionality in learning and systems, authentic relationship building, and developing sustainable community partnerships. Dr. Moore was named as a 2019 National Contender for Racial and Social Justice Leader Award through the National Education Association. And prior to this nomination, Dr. Moore was named the 2018 Teacher for Social Justice and the first recipient of the Epsilon Women of Service Award in 2015. She has been featured in Lawrence Business Magazine, that was in October of 2019, the KLWN radio talk shows, international webinars, and the National Education Association's social media platform, Member Mondays. So I hope you are really excited to hear from Dr. Moore, as excited as I am, because it is going to be a treat for us. So Dr. Moore, it is yours.
Thank you, Crystal. Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here to support the work that you are all leaning into. I'm going to prep my screen here for sharing with you all, and then hope that I can manage to see everybody and do what I need to do on this screen. So we're going to jump right in. Time is of the essence, of course, like in the actual literal for what you do in the day. So this session, discussing race in the space, am I ready to engage? What have I missed? So when we talk about leaning into racial equity across all contents, because this is a big push right now across our nation in terms of specific social impacts, current events, media, all those things, there are some pieces that we have to look at in terms of how do we know that we're there yet, especially when we talk about bringing it into professional settings in the current fields that we sit in. So this workshop is designed to kind of think about how have those been navigated for your organizations and the work that you're doing to bring it to the professional light and what might be needed to launch that for you. So to get started, I want to first do a land acknowledgement to acknowledge the traditional nations. So being in Kansas, the statehood at the time of our state included the Pawnee, the Kaw, and the Osage. And so honoring those who came before us, it's important to think about when we talk about specifically intersectional racial equity work, that I, as a facilitator of this work, as a coach and consultant of this work, I educate on this topic on land that was taken and stolen. And many of the institutions in which I stand and present are built on land that was taken from its original inhabitants. So to recognize and honor that, as well as a labor acknowledgement to those who have come before, those taken from their lands and brought to this land to build upon land that was stolen. So to recognize that intentionally in racial equity work as a preference. I would also like to ground today's learning and dedicating it to countless lives that have been impacted by fear, avoidance, deflection, in terms of not only not being able to discuss race, but also thinking about how it's been devalued for people as a part of just their being. And so my hope today is that you and I will create and engage productively in what I would like to call courageous learning space, that is a space for you to be able to reflect honestly and openly with yourself and with your colleagues here on this screen, while also centering your personal before your professional, that this work starts in the personal space before professional, but also knowing that this work is about present and future generations of young minds that we are centering each and every day, and young minds that watch us in hopes that we will be able to learn with them, and when appropriate, be their critically conscious teacher in any capacity, field, position that we serve for the roles that we do. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and start in with the content. So who am I? You got a lot about who I was at the beginning. I had no clue that all like that was a lot to read off. So I didn't think that was all going to come up. But yeah, so on the right side here, you see all the positional pieces, the professional pieces. But on the personal side, these are things I highly value for myself. These are the pieces I carry with me every single day. These are the roots that give me the inspiration to do what I do. That third one, being an auntie, is probably my favorite one, next to being a godmother. So these are the young children I hold closest to my heart. And when I center the work that I do in every single field, you heard in the bio, city government or offices I worked with, social services, everything I do, I'm centering my two youngest connections, which is a nephew and a goddaughter. So holding them close. And then thinking about, you know, the aspirations that I have in terms of traveling the world as a learner, being a caretaker for not just myself and my family, but also those who are in close contact with me, but also being a writer. And writing for me centers specifically spoken word and more in depth. I love writing learning pieces, whether it's presentations, different ways to be able to explore learning, college classroom curriculum, all those pieces. So writing for me is beyond just like writing a novel or those pieces. I really like to create learning spaces and productions. So now that you know more about me, here's the objectives of this quick, basically 50 minutes that we're down to now to go through. So thinking about exploring our own individual self-awareness, most of the work in equity starts with who are you? Like, who are you bringing to light to be able to do this work? If equity work begins as an outward exploration, it typically is not authentic and does not have the depth and intent that it can, or the impact it can, when it starts with self. Secondly, we're going to look at how do you evaluate your own readiness for racial conversation and dialogue. We're going to also analyze limitations within the racial dialogue that exists within you and maybe even your organization. And we're going to think about how do we create a foundation to build capacity for facilitating conversations through the use of protocols and conversational tools. So I'm going to show you some different things that could support with that. But again, our priority today is think about like, where do I show up in that work to then bring that to a professional space and highlight what I'm doing in my career field. So 4 agreements that Glenn Singleton wrote about in his book, Courageous Conversations About Race. Glenn Singleton talks about that these are the 4 things to be able to even touch on conversations that are inclusive of race. Number 1, Glenn says that you have to be able to stay engaged. And when we define engagement, it's not just being the active talker, the one that's always taking the notes, but also thinking about, are there ways in which I engage that disengage others from their critical learning? And how do I accommodate and modify my learning behaviors that make space for other folks to engage as well? Glenn's second one says that we have to speak our truth. Far different than speaking our mind. Our truth is centered in actual analysis of ourselves and an understanding of our experiences and our learning to be able to produce for the conversation. And truthfully told, if we're really speaking our truth, there are going to be some spaces where speaking my truth includes me telling you that I don't know, and that that's okay, because then I can think about the discomfort that comes with that, of being able to admit what I don't know, but I think I do, and what I don't know that I don't even know I don't know. So those discomforts that come with that as learners and practitioners of your field are important for this conversation, but they also have value, because understanding how I experience discomfort specifically when I'm talking about racial discussions is a higher and heightened level of awareness I have to be aware of for myself to engage in the conversations today. And the last piece that Glenn Singleton would advise, to expect and accept non-closure. I like to add the word settled in front of that word non-closure, because non-closure, it's not that it's not the same as agree to disagree. Many people will try to summarize those to be the same. They're not. And why they're not is agreeing to disagree says that there's still a level of hierarchy, meaning that you're saying that my experiences as they exist in my racial being cannot be correct or true. Therefore, you disagree with my experience. But what you're really saying is you're not able to, there's non-closure for you being able to accept that that's what the reality is for me, that might be different from your reality. And accepting that in a way that is settled, that says that by the end of our conversation, we may not walk away on the same page. However, I am still navigating, working through your experience disrupted all of my beliefs of what I thought was universal for people. And I'm going to work through that non-closure. And I'm going to know that that's going to happen and be okay when it does. And I'm going to be so okay with it that we have different experiences and understandings at this point in our journeys, that the next time I see you, I can still say hello. That's that part that I like to add for settled. Because sometimes people walk away from these conversations and it's very tense, in terms of now we're operating in spaces of avoidance in professional settings, and sometimes even social settings. And so that's not what this work needs. It's not what's going to build it. It's going to require that in that space that I also do some additional learning for myself as well. So as we finish up today, thinking about what will you do in your non-closure? What will you lean into learning for yourself, maybe even about yourself or your own understandings of some of these conversations about race as it centers the work that you do? So grounding, first thing I'd like to ask you is this. Because this topic today, we're going to center this racial piece, we're missing some things here. So with only 3 words, it could be a complete phrase, could be individual words. Could you drop in the chat 3 words to describe what your experiences have been discussing race? Think about all gamuts, professionally in your organization, socially, maybe you engage in a social media chat. With 3 words, can you drop in the chat words that would describe your experience as it's been for you discussing race? And as these words come in, just take some time after you've submitted yours to begin thinking about, what do you see there? What's similar? What's different? Think about what comes up for you as you read some of those words. Some of the words could have multiple meanings. Words such as tired, depending on who one is and their experience. Tired could be, I'm tired of having to talk about it, or I'm tired that these experiences continue to exist for people with different racial identities. So there's differences of what that could look like. Same with words like frustration. Like, is it the frustration of here we go again, or the frustration of this is my one's experience yet again, and what that feels and seems like for folks who experience it or folks who don't go through it. So yeah, so there's some themes here showing up in the words that can be common across all different spaces. And so thinking as you hold on to those, the next part I want to challenge you with and take you to is this. So I want you to hold on to those 3 words and think about the 3 words that you dropped in there as we go through today. Are there some pieces you can pull from today? And when we talk about non-closures, back at non-closure, you go and do some extra work before you come back to these topics again. Are there some things that you can grab onto? Are there some words that you would like to see change for your experience with racial discussions? Grab one or two of those words you might want to see change and think about as we go through. What are some pieces I can pull from that might help me be able to shift the experience that I'm having with racial dialogue? So, next question in the chat. If you could use a number between 1 and 100 to show how much of your life is impacted by race, what would your number be? So if you use a number in the range of 1 to 100 to describe how much of your life is impacted by race, think that this is percentage wise, so 1 to 100%. What would your number be? And think about the work we do today as not being definite. And what I mean by that is there are questions I'm going to ask you to respond to in the chat, things that I'll have you reflect on. That again, when I speak my truth, that agreement, I'm speaking my truth that where I'm at today with this is okay. It's okay where I'm starting with this conversation, knowing that I can reflect on these same prompts tomorrow, next month, next year, and think about what's changed. Nothing that we do in racial equity work is definite. It's always indefinite because things are always changing. Awareness is always growing. And so as you do some of these things in the chat, I want you to be open. I'm not going to say comfortable, but I want you to be open with going through that discomfort that may come up in terms of having to own today where you're at in your journey and knowing that there's no judgment, there's no shame. You are where you are. And the starting point is important just as well as where you're moving to. I see some audio things going on for folks. So again, if there's an audio piece on my end, please feel free to signal that for me. I do have a pair of headphones sitting side by side. If that's everyone who's having audio issues, I can definitely plug those up. So I want you to think that number you just grabbed. And what I'd like for you to think about is reflecting on what did you center? How did you come up with that number? What did you reflect on? Was it specific settings and locations, context? Did it require specific people to be in those spaces? Think about what percentage you came up with. Was it based off some equation of how much of your day is this versus this versus this in a week's time? What did you reflect on to land on that number? And as you think about that, here's some things I'll give you to think about. Oftentimes, with that question, someone might have a score that's lower than 100, which is perfectly fine. You are where you are. You could have a 0 on that or a 1. What I would offer to you is this. Racial impact in everyone's life is 100%. The level of consciousness that one has of that impact may not always match the impact. Meaning that whatever number you put down today, that could be how conscious you are of how race impacts that situation. But the impact for you is 100% because it's your being, it's who you are. Also thinking about, did you define impact in terms of the impact that you give other people based off your race, or the impact of race in general, receiving and given? That part's huge too to think about when we talk about that. So things to think about for critical understanding. First piece is very important. Race versus ethnicity versus ancestry and heritage versus nationality are all 4, 5 different things. None of them are synonymous nor interchangeable. Now, over time, society has made some of them that way, but if we go back to the actual roots, what we discover here is when we talk about conversations that not gone so well in race, sometimes it's because the definitions that people are using to define race they're not on the same page. You might be using ethnicity to talk about race. And in some of these, we're going to look at some of this, that there can be some exclusion depending on how you've learned or been socially conditioned to define race versus getting back to historical meanings of race and how those shifted over time and who those shifts benefited. Race is socially constructed, as is gender, as is sexuality. They're all social constructs. Therefore, at any given time, race can be manipulated to benefit a dominant society or racial identity. That's important to know as well. Race is not an issue. As a society, certain people have been conditioned to have an issue with race. So that in itself opens the door of race is not a problem. there are spaces that it was designed to have problem with race. And because of that, now this is how we have differences of experiences, differences of understanding, and the differences of the impacts that race shows up. And that's what we have to look at, is what is the cause of what is showing disparities across race, differences in racial experiences. What's the cause of that? Because the race itself is not the issue. That places the blame on the folks who have the diverse racial identities. We have to look at what's happening with me, my organization, my profession, that is conditioned to not look at that. Attempting to discuss or teach race without personal work is 1,000% counterproductive. To be able to have these dialogues, it takes a lot of personal work and personal learning and education before that can begin to show up in professional spaces to make an impact. Skipping over the personal level means that the work that we do at the professional level, at an organizational level, will at some point either stall or cave in and fall apart. So to make it the best that you can for what you're seeking to do, there has to be personal work involved in that. You're going to see these two little ears perk up down here. There's a friend in my lap because he can't be unattended, apparently. Discussing race is not a solution for system change. It is merely a service level requirement to actually begin transformational work in systems. So again, while the topic of this workshop is discussing race in the space, just getting to be able to discuss it productively does not lead to systems change. Discussion is just the beginning step. So those are all critical understandings to think about as we go through today, because I don't want folks to leave here thinking like, oh, if I know how to talk about it better, just talking, it doesn't change systems. That's going to take active work. So two different things that build up and they have a direct correlation with each other. So when we talk about the personal level of work, this is an example of what people call the identity wheel. And so this wheel, what it really looks at is we have a lot of different parts of our identity. And I'm not going to say like multiple identities, because all of this makes one identity for one person. So every single being and body has all these different intersections happening all at one time. So if you begin to look at this wheel and think about, okay, inside the circle, how do I classify my age group? How do I classify my race? Different than classifying my ethnicity. How do I classify either one of those? What would the term be that I use for my mental ability, my physical ability, my sexual orientation, my national origin? That green one, if you're gonna make a difference in yellow and green, probably should say something like my sex, my sexual, not sexuality, but my sex assigned at birth, different than gender identity expression, because those are two different things too. Again, this is not a wheel that I made. These just, you can Google identity wheels and people design them all the time. So the inner layer of that wheel is things that are, they're primary. You're born with them. They're not necessarily fluent or silent, because when you think about gender expression identity, they're the piece that like you come with just by being born. The outside wheel are things that are shifting daily for some people. You can literally make a goal in one of those and establish that goal. So when you look at the outer wheel, you have more control per se over that outer wheel. The inner wheel, you basically, these things happen. Different levels of ability, age, the race, your ethnicity, they're there. They're not gonna be, they don't shift, or you don't have it, they're not marking and picking and describing that for yourself. The outer wheel, you can do all that. So when you look at this identity wheel for yourself and begin to think about what are the layers that I have and what intersections, what I offer is this: all the different pieces that you can put out there for yourself. For example, for me, I identify myself as a young adult. And I don't believe that, I'm not saying there's like an old adult afterwards, but the category for like a mid-level adult, that's how I consider myself based off just my age alone. My race is Black. My ethnicity is African American. My physical and mental ability, I would consider myself able-bodied. If I go through this entire wheel, my gender, I consider myself woman, female. Family, my family is matriarchy based. I would define my family as matriarchy based compared to a single parent home or two-parent home, because that language does not fit my community. My community, I was raised with great aunties, mom. I had grandparents and uncles present as well as my dad, but my family is very, like matriarchs are the pillar of it. So all of my learning and understanding of life comes from my matriarchy. So my family is matriarch centered. And I use that language above single parent family or two parent family for me, from my experience. So you can kind of see how I piece this wheel together. So as I do that, begin to think about, if you had to stop and think, which layers of your identity on this wheel, if you can think about how you filter experiences, what would be your top 3 layers that when things happen, as you witness things on the news, things happen to you, what are the top 3 layers that you filter through every single day for yourself? The most common ones that are going to show up. Typically, those top 3 are where all of your focus is going to funnel. Even within those top 3, though, for any given person, race will still be a difference. It will make an impact. So we could say political belief, whatever group you define it, independent, Republican, Democrat, and all the other ones I don't even know. Within that, there's still a difference in experience by race. It's going to break things down even more. So we can say that things are universal. They're not truly, because of all the different layers that go without the intersections. So as I think about what are the top 3 things I filter the most, for me, I don't even need a top 3. I just need a top 2. My top 2 are race and gender. As a Black woman, the experiences I have every single day when I'm watching things on the TV, in conversations, though I'm filtering everything I see, hear, experience through those 2 things specifically, and I can track that back to where that became a solidified thing for me. So when I'm working with identity for yourself, when you can begin to identify what are those top 3 layers that you filter through the most, that's going to begin to show up in terms of like, okay, if race is not in my top 3, what does that mean for me? But even if I have another top 3 that's different, doesn't include race, how does race show up in those 3 categories I picked? Because even income, SES status, has impacts by race as proven by national data. When we look at different pools of money that's accessible for folks living below the line of poverty, the racial impacts there are huge. We publish data about that in the US all the time. If you don't believe me, just look it up. Look at the categories of that. So your pieces, if you process through your 3 layers, what are the top 3 that you filter through almost daily, that you rely on? They're showing up in almost every experience you have. We can start to talk about, how do we talk about race more in the spaces of behavioral health? But oftentimes people enter this conversation looking at, let's just start with the behaviors we're seeing and see if we can shift those behaviors to get different results. But if you want to make that conversation go a little bit deeper, you have to back up. This is why personal work is important. As an individual, me, I have to think about the beliefs that go with the behaviors that I exhibit, but also the experiences that are channeling my beliefs that move me into my behaviors. Every behavior, whether I have supports for my behaviors or not, behaviors are actually the same as being. So my way of being is impacted by the beliefs that I have, and those beliefs are impacted by my experiences. So therefore, if race is going to be a critical part of my identity, to begin thinking about what are the racial experiences I have that have led me to the beliefs that I have, that then you get the behaviors you get from me in specific contexts and settings, that then lead us to the results that we get in data, in interactions, whatever that might be. So as you're reflecting through this, thinking about how do you shift through those 4 pieces? Most organizations begin to start by addressing behaviors, but the work of racial equity work, when you intersect race, has to go all the way back to beliefs and experiences. And from that, that's why we talk about systemic change. You can change a system when the folks involved in the system or the organization shift the beliefs and experiences, or analyze the experiences they have to get better results. If you start with behaviors, then literally the work will just be surface level. It doesn't move much further. So how do you take this work deeper with your experiences and beliefs and looking at how those impact behaviors to get the results you're getting? That could be as simple as just saying hello to people. My behaviors in saying hello, well, what's my belief around saying hello? Before education, I was in retail management. Retail management, if you didn't know this, because they have a lot of nifty little phrases that actually a lot of organizations use them and don't realize where they come from. Retail management is where we got grin and greet, within 20 feet, grin and greet. And then it shrunk to within 8 feet, grin and greet, which basically says, proximity wise, we were trained to think about how close is that person to me to be worthy of a greeting, just be acknowledged. My belief, where do my belief around greetings come from? My family. In my community, I was raised in a historically all Black community. My daily lived life outside of our cul-de-sac, our neighborhood, our block, when we would go into bigger city space, Walmart, grocery store, that's where I would see racial diversity for my community for being a Black child. What I learned though at home was I was taught to always say hello, specifically to people who look like me, and make sure I greeted them first. And my grandmother, my great aunts, my mom would say, we do that because we can't always guarantee that folks like us are getting greeted and welcomed the same way everybody else does. So to make sure that we have the impact on each other, we always say hello. And that naturally moves over into I greet everyone first. My experience with that is in typical spaces, I usually have to say hello first to people who look like me and people who don't look like me. Can everybody hear me? Okay. So thinking about where that comes from. So then because of that, the behavior you're going to get is I'm going to take greetings very seriously, greeting myself, greeting other people. It's going to be a value to me, which then leads to the results I get. So if that's not everyone's experience or belief, greetings have a different result for your organization or for you. So that's what it looks like to process back to what are the behaviors that we have around racial topics specifically, what are the beliefs or the experiences. If you take it a little bit deeper, what are the experiences people have with conversations about race? Think about the 3 words you put in the chat earlier. If your experience was not so great, you might have formed some sort of belief about race, which now shows up in your behaviors when someone brings up race. And now you get the results you get over and over again. So if you're going to shift the results, you have to go back through those 3 and go all the way back to the experience that you had with it that lets you shape that belief, that lets you think about that behavior. Behavioral health, this is kind of like the definition of what you all do. It's a tracking back of this to help people understand where they need to process to gain their coping skills, their navigational skills, to be able to get better results for themselves mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, all those different realms. Okay, so here we go. 4 pictures here. Now, drop in the chat, which of these 4 is African American? By letter. So A, B, C, D. Which 4 are African American? So I see different responses coming in. So these 4. So one of the things we talk about vocabulary readiness for racial equity dialogues. And so again, I showed those different layers, so race, ethnicity, heritage and ancestry, nationality, 4 different things. And so African American would be described as an ethnic group. And so with that, one thing that we have to look at is race originally defined as content of melanin in skin, nails, hair, and eyes, which says that race is a physical piece that shows up in just walking in a space. Ethnicity is about cultural and daily lived practices that link to a specific culture, which is what African American would be. So based off of those definitions and identity, the 4 folks you see on the screen here, Vice President Kamala Harris, she has Jamaican and Indian heritage. Next there, you have Charlize Theron, who is South African, which in context saying South African nationality and being in the United States, she could also mark African American as well. She can identify as African American. Rihanna is from Barbados. I don't know the language. Is it Barbadian? I don't know. I've lived in the Bahamas, but I did not explore Barbados. And then you have Elon Musk, who also identifies with African ethnicity. So when we think about that, So language readiness, when we talk about race versus ethnicity versus heritage and ancestry versus nationality, do we have the language to be discussing race? Again, if you go all the way back, sometimes conversations of race don't go so well because we're not on the same page. So when we say African American, that cannot be ascribed by looks or even just melanin content. Only race can. So what that says is when we talk about race, we're looking at first and foremost race by color, second, race by culture, and third, race by consciousness. Those are the three different layers of race. So first and foremost, race was always designed as melanin content. And again, melanin content shows up in hair, nails, skin, and eyes. So with that being said, you have what you have on the screen here are you have two Black or brown folks and you have two white folks is what you have. That would be the racial layer. Now notice within race, you can have all different ethnic groups, ancestries, heritages, and nationalities show up, right? I could be Black in Jamaica. I can be Black in Bahamian, but I can also be white in Bahamian. As I learned living in the Bahamas, there's an entire portion of the Bahamas that is national born and raised, and they look like Charlize Theron here and Elon Musk. So within race, we have to be really clear on what we're talking about and know which language we're using, because oftentimes if I'm not racially ready with my vocab, what I can do is off-put the conversation in terms of now folks are offended to come in. Because I don't know if you've had this experience or not, but if you've ever called someone who identifies as Black or brown a general term based off your own biases and beliefs and was not their identity and how they respond. For example, in Jamaica, to call a Jamaican African American, it's yes, they will let you know. So when we think about that, language like this, and also where the term African American came from, and we have a lot of that language. When we over-identify folks from Latin American countries, South American countries as Mexican, maybe even Hispanic terms, like because some of those terms were not created by the folks living those identities. So in racial readiness vocabulary check, we think about what is the language I'm using to discuss race, and have I analyzed how I'm looking at that separately from ethnicity, ancestry, heritage, and nationality, because they have different meanings. Most of the things we look at right now, we're looking at the depths of how does race by melanin impact the things we're seeing in front of us, the data, all those pieces. And then secondly, how does ethnicity, or as we would say, race by culture, show up in those layers as well. So knowing that vocab is one of the first starts after looking at in terms of have you processed for yourself how you're showing up in your experiences. So why I don't talk about race? What are some reasons why you don't talk about race, or maybe the organization that you're working within that you perceive as why they don't talk about race? What comes up when people don't talk about race? Why don't they? You can drop those in the chat. You can also unmute and drop them in the space too. I'm assuming they have unmute power. I might have made an overassumption there. So why don't people talk about race? Why don't you talk about race? Why doesn't race come up in your organization? Okay, unsure what to say. Absolutely. This is part of that readiness check, right? So not being sure what to say, my discomfort with it, that all might be part of my readiness piece of it. Do you know what your defenses are? Do you know what happens when you get uncomfortable? Yes, the perception of being racist, absolutely. Perception that it makes other people uncomfortable. So lots of pieces around the discomfort part. And remember Glenn Singleton's agreement, he says that one of the prefaces of being able to get into racial discussions is to be able to experience discomfort. And the thing that I love the most about that agreement, it's not saying, I recognize when I'm uncomfortable. It's saying experience discomfort. So let me give you an analogy. So anybody in this group a fan of roller coasters? I know we're all grown people on here, but some grown people still like to have fun. Anyone a fan of roller coasters? Got one, two roller coaster fans. Okay, I see some hands in the chat. So we're about like at 7 now. Okay, so you are the people that this example won't really hit hard for. But now let's put that aside. Where are the folks like me who cannot stand a roller coaster? You're not going to get me on that thing if you pay me $1 million. Where are those people? Because you are my people. All right, so of those of you who are coming in saying that, nope, that's not me, no roller coaster, let's go one layer deeper. Those folks coming in right now, I don't like them, they're not for me. How many of you rode one to know that you didn't like it? Because sometimes you can put like kids with food, like it looks green, we don't eat it, right? Like we can do it by looks, but actually experiencing it. So how many folks on here with their hand emoji still up did it, like learn to not like it by actually experiencing it? A couple folks. All right, so let me talk to 2 of those folks who said, I don't like them and I learned to not like them because I actually experienced them. So 2 people on me, let me just pick some people here. And again, whoever is doing the tech, if they need to be unmuted, please help me with that. If not, folks, if I say your name, please unmute. So I see some hands up. So I would like, so MJ, I'm not sure if yours is up from the like them or the first one, but MJ, if your hand is up from going on them and not liking them, could you unmute? And what I want you to replay to the group here is, can you reflect back to the first time riding one, when that ride started to when it ended? What were you doing as you went through the ride?
Sure, yes. Hello, I'm Monica Jackson. So when, hello there. So when I first rode, it was just exciting. And even though it made my heart go fast, it was just something fun, something exciting.
And
I always,
do you ride them today? Do you like them today still?
yes, even though I'm older.
Gotcha, okay. You still like them? Okay.
I still like them, yeah.
Okay, great. So I can't tell, so in the chat, so Cheryl, you're someone that put that you don't like them, right?
Right.
Okay, and did you not like them based off of riding one before?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, can you replay for me? Think about the first or the last, there might be multiple, one of the times you rode a roller coaster. When that ride started, what were you doing to get through that ride as the roller coaster went on? Knowing as you discovered you didn't like it, what were you doing to get through the ride?
Gripping the bar really hard, hanging on to the person next to me, you know.
Okay, thank you. One more person doesn't like them, that doesn't like them by experience. What were you doing as you went through the ride? Anyone can unmute and tell me. Anyone?
Hey, can you all hear me?
I can.
Yeah, so my head was down the entire time. I did not enjoy it. I was screaming for dear life. And when I finally got off, my stomach was hurting for the entire day. So never again.
Right. So I want folks to think about this, because this is why I tell kids this too, like pre-K college kids, because I've taught all the gamuts. I tell students this too. That agreement of experience, so discomfort in racial conversation. When you experience discomfort, this is what that agreement means. It's not just recognizing you're uncomfortable. Think about what your peers just shared here. One person was screaming, someone was gripping the bar. Me, that's what I do. I grip the bar or the person next to me so tight that they will have a bruise in the shape of my handprint on their body when we're done. I close my eyes, and you can be in the ride with me, but even though you're there, we're not gonna have a conversation because I'm probably gonna be humming the entire time with my eyes closed. Like that's how we cope, right? But think about that. We took some time in an uncomfortable situation to figure out what we do in that space to get through, to endure it, to get to the other side, which is when the ride is over. Because the other option is we can hope that the ride has a malfunction and stops. There's a good chance, 50-50, that malfunction, we don't walk away from that living and breathing. So we don't hope for those things, right? We hope for the ending of it, to get to the resolution of just stop the car, we're done with the ride. So what we have to do on this roller coaster to get through is an example of experiencing discomfort. I know I'm uncomfortable, but how am I getting through this? Gripping the bar, closing my eye. I have some strategies, right? Doesn't make it go away. Racial conversations in professional spaces have to be that level of the conversation is uncomfortable, but do I know what I begin to do when I experience discomfort? And do I have mechanisms and tools and protocols to rely on to get through that discussion? Because on the other side of that discussion, what might await me is new learning, new perspective, self-reflection. So that's what we think about when we think about racial conversation. It's the roller coaster ride, a different kind. So when people talk about discomfort, analyze it through that lens. So what you put in the chat there, some of the things that came up, even in the first thing we did with like, what are the 3 words to describe your experience with racial conversation? You had some of these already showing up. Fatigue, that tiring of like, again, 2 sides. I'm tired of talking about it versus I'm tired, this is my experience, I have to bring it up all the time. Fear, and list, we already heard all the fears that came up, you named them. Fear of being wrong, fear of being mislabeled, all those different pieces. Fear of being, looked at as not knowing something. Those are valid. Ignorance, I just don't know enough. However, what you do know enough about with time and reflection is you know enough about yourself and your racial experiences and your racial being. Even if your experiences racially intersect from a place of social dominance and privilege, still you know enough about yourself to know that there are some differences. And sometimes we don't talk about race because disbelief. I cannot believe we're still having to talk about this. Like this is still happening in 2021. We still have disparities in data across all institutions. After we had Barack Obama as president, that could be disbelief, or it could be disbelief of that really happened. Some people can be so paralyzed in the experiences, knowing that race is an impact for people, that the paralysis leads them to not be able to talk about it at all. I have no language for this because I'm in shock. Like this is what the narrative is for people. And that's okay to have these reactions. Again, all these are different realms of experience discomfort, like what goes on here to be able to name it. So when you name fear, can you name what your actual fear is? And can you unpack that to the point of like, I know what the fear is of myself, not just a perception of what other people think of me, but my own internal fear about my own self. So knowing those fears is important because if we don't process those different reasons why we don't talk about race, we don't make a shift. And again, if discussion is the first requirement to get the solutions change, you have to have this in place. So look at this picture here real quick. This picture came from, I believe it's an Italian artist, right as pandemic was launching. It was like a comic strip thing, but it's actually considered an art piece. So look at this here. This picture is meant to just showcase the experiences of folks during the pandemic. Tell me one thing you see in this photo. Describe something you see. Just as simple as there are 6 apartments and they each have a balcony, outside balcony on them. I'll take that one out for you. What else do you see? You can go in depth about the people and what's happening with the people. You've got someone playing a violin.
It's just people's experience of the pandemic is not what your experience might be.
So I want you to come back to just the picture and describing what you see in the picture. So someone said disparity in comfort between ground floor and the balcony. Absolutely. So the ground of the buildings and the top level, we've got some different experiences happening there. Okay, people dying in the street. So yes, if you didn't catch the 2 folks at the bottom, those are people, this is like the corner van. There's a person sitting all by themselves, lonely. Someone said an elderly person, essential workers on the ground being exposed. And so if you look at all these different observations, one observation that we have to look at that did not come up in the chat or as we share out, but did you notice the racial pieces intersecting with this photo? Can you see where the folks have been shaded to represent melanin content? Here, 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 up throughout here, we don't have that representation. What message could that mean? It could mean a lot of different things, but we know what it looks like for a pandemic in our community. We live in a community that at one point we hit 3 Native people dying a day, right? So again, in our conversations, even to just say this picture, there are folks in there like, I see what would be predicted as like white skin tone, a tan skin tone, a brown skin tone. Talking about race is that simple. And so when we think about like why we don't talk about it, if I can just say the person has brown skin, and part of what, when we describe things we see, this might be what's happening for people. We have a hierarchy of race, of racial words. We have race, racial, racism, racist. There's this line here. Most times what happens is I might skip over even looking at race being an impact or identifying race as a characteristic or valuing race as a characteristic, because these two right here are the base level. Just being able to say, like, the person has brown skin, the person's white, the person's brown, the person's tan. And sometimes what happens is the world is conditioned to hear these 2 words in red when all I'm trying to discuss is these 2 words in green. And so because of that, something as simple as looking at a picture to describe what we see in the photo, we might skip over identifying race and melanin and just vivid imagery, because we might have been conditioned somewhere that one time I brought it up and someone called me racist. We saw that in the first activity because that's what the world's conditioned to do. But just thinking about race as a descriptor, no different than my shirt is marigold yellow, my skin is brown. If I can talk about things race and racial and have a conversation here, this conversation here can help shift what happens here and help prevent acts of racism and folks who label themselves and identify in groups and groupings that would be identified as racist. So again, this is why you need your parameters to talk about it, is because you have all these things going on. You have fears that you identified why you don't talk about race. And so again, to navigate through all of that, you have to have parameters to talk about race. So in organizations, when people say we're going to talk about race, if there's no parameters, it's already setting you up to have something that might go off the Richter and then not have an impact. And that's, you want to avoid that. Glenn Singleton is just one example of a process or procedure that you have to be able to do to talk about race. There's just one example. So he has what he calls the 4 agreements. And again, the book title that comes from right there at the bottom, Courageous Conversations About Race. You need a protocol to talk about race because you're not conditioned to learn to talk about it in specific spaces in a healthy, productive way. So you need a protocol to do that, even if it's about behavioral health. So what do you have to do to get there? First of all, provide opportunities for yourself to explore race. That starts with you. What is your racial experience? What is your historical background and theory knowledge? Do you know the backgrounds of how racial impacts show up for people? The backgrounds of yours. When people say that things are not okay racially, the symbolism things, like what's the history of those things? You have to know all those, that's education. And make intentional space to celebrate and honor race. That's like a key thing. So that's like that multicultural diversity level. That's the difference in multicultural level of work and equity work, is just celebrating like, different cultures and different skin tones. Teaching kids to celebrate that same thing, right? How do you teach people to value that, to love it about themselves, including you in whatever skin color you have? Using inquiry rather than response. When things show up and we hear things, are you conditioned to begin responding immediately, like on social media? Or are you conditioned to ask more questions and dig deeper? Again, remember, experiences, beliefs, behaviors, results. If you're conditioned to always be the one responding, you're going to get the same results over and over. You want to go that deeper, get to beliefs and experiences, learn to ask questions that really help open up the conversation, and finding multiple perspectives and resources. Because again, one Black or brown body does not always mean that we're all going to think the same and have the same experiences. And again, those intersectional identity will. Race and income have a huge shift. Race and urban versus suburban settings, rural settings, different shifts and impacts. But you find multiple perspectives to talk about that. So how do we connect race to well-being in our fields? Things to consider: emotionality. Fear, anxiety, anger, depression, and a million other words that describe how people's emotions are. There's racial connection to those. Again, remember I talked about tired has 2 different layers of it. Emotionality has different layers that show up racially. So when we look at some of those words that are on the screen, how is that connected to someone's racial being? So when we center like solutions for mental well-being, emotional well-being, do we provide solutions about emotionality that are very universal? Do we provide them that lean into the racial impacts that might lead one to feel certain ways based on racial pieces? Sleep deprivation, for example. You can do, I've seen many people in organizations in behavioral health, they have these little assessments in terms of like all these different categories, and sleep deprivation might be flagged for like well-being and like mental emotional stability. Sleep deprivation has some racial pieces to it. Some people don't sleep very well at night because, or I've heard this many times, folks who have young boys of color, teens of color, college kids of color, and they're male, then the data around what's happening with men of color in the nation right now, if I'm a parent of a kid of color and a male and they don't live with me, I might sleep better when they're under my roof because I know that they're safe, right? Native Indigenous communities have a lot of women missing right now. If I'm a mother, a sister, my sleep deprivation, there's racial pieces tied to that. Some folks get more sleep at night because the racial impacts they endure during the day allow them to sleep better at night. Some people don't have that. Sense of community, we talk about that a lot. However, my community, both professionally and personally, racial interactions are going to show up in both of those spaces. So my sense of community can't be universal if no one's considering how my race plays into my community. So when we talk about behavioral health and how people show up, we have to look at all those parts and pieces in terms of, have I provided some universal pieces of this? Are I really digging into how is race showing up in these different layers? This is just a couple examples of what that looks like. So I'm gonna stop here and end with this part because this is like the getting to the deeper pieces, but to think about it again, our goal is think about readiness. So what do you consider next for yourself? First of all, how do you know when you're at your limit of tolerance or below or above that, where you can't take in the conversation, it becomes heated for you, defenses go up? And how do you know when you're below your threshold of learning? Meaning, I'm just showing up here because you're talking about race. I know that some folks mention like, when conversation about race is mandated, right? When it's mandated, I want to do it. I might just sit back and do nothing, act like I'm engaged. So if I need to be above the threshold of learning and below my limit of tolerance, have productive conversation. What data and norms exist in your organization to explore, analyze, and question racial impacts? Again, you have to have protocols. You can't just bring up race in a space that's not been a part of and hope it's going to make some differences. You need to have some norms about how you're going to talk about it, explore it, analyze it, and question it. What education are you missing? Have you had opportunity to explore the significance of race as it connects to your specific field? Where do you find those at if they don't exist? And how are you conditioned to respond to feedback and dialogue inclusive of racial influences? Because sometimes we receive feedback, and if the person doesn't look like us, sound like us, know our story, we're conditioned to be defensive instead of taking that feedback for learning, because I can give a response that may be racially exclusive. I want to think about that in my work as well. So again, everything starts with the personal level to build up to professional. So this, again, just thinking about readiness, there's my information. If you have questions, please send me an email. This is just a starter workshop that I encourage people to think about these prompts. It doesn't mean that this is like the launch all be all part, but it's the part to begin with if you're bringing that to an organization where it typically has not been or has not been the norm to discuss it. So thank you for your time today. I hope you have a great day.
Thank you so much for coming to us. I told you that this was going to be a fantastic hour with lots of great nuggets, and it definitely was. I was hanging on the edge of my seat. Make sure that you check the chat because there was CE information in the chat. If you didn't catch that, go back and look at that. We'll have another great presentation on Tuesday, 9/28 by Dr. Brandy Clark, supporting children's behavioral health during a pandemic and beyond. So set your alarm for that and be back here on Tuesday at noon. And that is what we have for you. So have a great weekend. Thank you, Dr. Moore, for bringing us great information. I really enjoyed it today. I'm sure everybody else did here as well.
Thank you.